In the name of God, who values, respects and loves individually each and every creature. Amen. There's a little story called The Time Is Now. And it goes like this. During World War II, a German widow hid some Jewish refugees in her home. When her friends found out, they became alarmed. "You are risking your life," they said. "I know," she replied. "Then why are you persisting in this foolishness?" they demanded. "Because," she replied, "the time is now, and I am here." Today's gospel highlights this continuing division between the different racial groups, Jews and Gentiles, with the interaction between Jesus, a Jew, and a Gentile woman. Jesus at first appears to remain safely behind the barriers of racial difference, but then with an open mind, he listens to the woman's arguments and changes his attitude. And by changing his attitude, he bridges the gap between races. He shows respect and value for another's difference, resulting in a miracle of God's healing powers. And as one theologian says, the healing is the overcoming of prejudice and boundaries that separate. And Jesus calls us to follow his example, to act with respect, tolerance, and compassion to those who are different, to those who are marginalised, to break down barriers, close gaps, build relationships, and perhaps change our attitudes. And this earth looks pretty good, doesn't it? This earth is made up of people and groups, all unique, all different, and God loves them all. I reckon I'm that little pink on there. And uniqueness and difference is crucial for our growth. It widens our horizons. It moves us out of our comfort zones. It allows us to see that we are only a tiny part of the whole picture, which comes together to form something exquisitely beautiful. Uniqueness and difference is good, provided it doesn't hurt others or impinge on another's freedom by becoming selfish behaviour. A fundamental part of humanity's psychological makeup is our need to belong to groups of people who think and feel the same way we do. Our in-group. Whereas those who think and behave or are different don't belong and become the out-group. And in our judgments, the out-group or the other are automatically demeaned, devalued and disrespected without considering circumstances or situations. And this is the basis of prejudice and discrimination. And it all relates back to love of self, where we need to prove our own self-worth to others and to protect the egos that we have already established. And we lose tolerance and compassion for the differences between those that make up this world, and the gap becomes wider. In this, the Church's season of creation, we need to acknowledge that the gap between the earth and its creatures and humanity is widening. The Bible tells us that God gave humanity the responsibility to be custodians of God's creation, to safeguard, nurture and respect the earth and its creatures. Yet the underlying attitude of past and present humanity seems to be that God gave us creation to use, abuse, and treat as disposable. A few weeks ago, I watched an SBS series about the seafood industry called What's the Catch by Matthew Evans. Did anybody else see that? Oh, there's a few shaking their heads. I thought, that sounds interesting. But while I was looking to be informed, little did I realise that I would be horrified. The first episode was on the supply of prawns to the Australian consumer, us. And surprisingly, Australia came out of it quite well, with many fishing companies going to great lengths and expense to protect the future of supply and our marine environment. Whereas in Asia, prawns are grown in farms and pumped full of protein, antibiotics and steroids, with the owners making it quite clear that it was a profit-making business with no concern for any environmental impact. What was absolutely heartbreaking and devastating was how they supplied the thrice daily feeding of protein. Their trawlers dredged the seabed, taking absolutely everything and leaving it an absolute desert, bare and barren. This catch was what they called trash fish, where every sea creature too small or too young to be profitable was ground up and fed to the farm prawns. While in Australia, raw seafood by law now must be labelled with country of origin, but cooked seafood supplied in restaurants, fast food chains, etc. doesn't. While only slightly more expensive, and despite taste tests and surveys showing the superior size, texture and taste of Australian prawns, fast food industry chains like Domino's, Pizza Hut, etc. still refuse to even consider using Australian environmentally caught seafood, but persist in supporting cheaper, tasteless feedlot Asian prawns supplied by powerful businesses that are raping our marine environment. As we see in the Gospel reading, Jesus values life and through a change of attitude heals divisions between the humble and the powerful. And the earth and its creatures rely on our actions for their survival, and our call from God is to steward them. So how can we change this current attitude in the seafood industry? The program recommends that we have the courage to ask your restaurant or cafe whether they are serving Australian seafood. They also ask us to contact our federal member to make it and ask them to make it mandatory to display the country of origin on cooked seafood. A lasting image for me of the program was a little solitary crab sliding down the sloping wall of a large metal bin, clawing and struggling frantically to hold on, to escape that downward slide into the morass of other sea creatures to be destroyed. Maybe it upset me so much because in that little crab, perhaps I saw a metaphor for me, or maybe humanity. But there is always hope. In the seafood industry, some Australian restaurants are moving to Australian seafood. And in the big picture, there appears to be a zeitgeist moving through Australia, where we are finally beginning to value and respect the different ways of our First Nations people, who were custodians of the land for 70,000 years. And perhaps, like Jesus, we too can change our attitude towards our day-to-day custodianship of our patch of God's creation that we inhabit. And there is so much that each one of us can do, and you all know what that is. In fact, you could all probably tell me things that I could be doing. But the fact is, it begins now with us, with a change of attitude, an open mind, and acceptance that we are called by God to do this. The theologian Thomas Berry writes, "Whether human or other, all living things combine to become a single integral community of the earth. Every being has its own role to fulfill, its own dignity. Every being has its own voice. Every being enters into communion with other beings. This capacity for relatedness, for presence to others, is a capacity possessed by every living creature throughout the entire universe. As Richard Rohr says, everything belongs. And belonging together is when difference melts away. So we are all connected as one. And what one member does affects the fragile balance of the whole world. Berry believes that we in this age are called to participate in the great work of our time, which is to carry out the transition from previous periods of human devastation of the earth to a period when humans will be present to the planet in a mutually beneficial manner, so that the earth will be a home for all. So that's rather exciting, isn't it? A final story, but with a deep meaning. A young student asked, "Rabbi, how can we tell the exact moment that night has ended and day has begun? Is it when it is so light that we can no longer distinguish a star in the morning sky?" "No, my son," answered the rabbi. "How can we tell then?" answered the student. The rabbi said, "We know that night has ended and the day has begun when we look into the face of the person next to us and recognize that person to be our brother or sister. Until then, we have spent our lives in the darkness, but at that moment we have awakened into the light of day." Jesus looked into the face of the Syrophoenician woman, and day dawned. He recognized not a stranger who was different, but a sister in distress, and he responded. The poet Emerson said, "Nature is the thin veil between the face of God, and for us, day will have begun when we, like St. Francis of Assisi, can recognize in the face of creation our brothers and sisters. The time is now, and we are here." Amen.